My name is Abdullah Al-Salem, and I am 47 years old, born into a family where faith was heavier than breath and obedience was stronger than love. From my earliest memory, I was wrapped in verses, rules, and warnings, taught to fear hell before I learned to hope, and trained to submit before I learned to ask why. My father was a sheikh, my grandfather was a sheikh, and their shadows stretched across my entire childhood, shaping every thought and every desire. I memorized the Quran before I could fully understand its meaning, and by the time my voice deepened, I was already standing before men twice my age, leading prayers and issuing counsel that sounded confident even when my heart trembled. People called me blessed, chosen, anointed, yet inside I felt hollow, like a vessel filled with echoes rather than life. Each day began before sunrise, with cold water on my face and a forehead pressed into carpet, whispering ancient words that promised mercy but delivered only fear. I begged Allah to cleanse me, to accept me, to spare me, yet the silence grew heavier each year, and my prayers felt like stones thrown into an endless well. As a teacher, I demanded discipline and purity, repeating the warnings I myself had inherited, telling boys barely old enough to shave that a single failure could condemn them forever. At night, their frightened faces followed me into sleep, and I woke soaked in sweat, haunted by visions of fire and judgment that would not leave. My wife saw the strain in my eyes, the weight in my shoulders, and sometimes she asked quietly why I looked so tired after prayer. I had no answer, because how could I explain that I felt further from God the more I sought Him? In public, I wore certainty, but in secret, I carried questions that frightened me more than any sermon on hell. I wondered why love was never mentioned, why mercy always came with conditions, and why obedience was prized above compassion. I remembered being a child, sitting beside my mother, listening to stories of prophets and longing for a God who would sit with me instead of judge me. That longing never left, but it learned to hide beneath layers of duty and fear. By 40, I was respected, secure, and spiritually starving. Every sermon I preached felt heavier than the last, every ruling more fragile than it appeared. Sometimes I stood alone in the mosque long after everyone had gone, staring at the empty rows, asking a question I barely dared to shape. Is this truly the path to God? The words echoed back without reply, and I would leave with my chest tight, my hands shaking, and my soul aching for something unnamed. I did not yet know that this ache was a summons, that the hunger inside me was the beginning of mercy, or that the fear which had governed my life was about to be shattered. All I knew was that the mask was cracking, and beneath it lay a man desperate for truth, trembling on the edge of a story he could not yet imagine. I carried that trembling into each prayer, each lesson, each step through the familiar streets, unaware that heaven was already leaning toward me, waiting for the moment when fear would finally loosen and faith would be reborn. That moment approached slowly, like dawn creeping across desert sand, subtle and silent, and until even my stubborn heart could no longer deny its glow. Yet before the light would rise, a storm had to break, and I stood unknowingly at its center, carrying secrets and questions that would soon demand answers, whether I wished for them or not. The walls I had built around my soul began to tremble, and each breath felt like a farewell to the life I had known. I walked through my days as if through water, slowed by invisible resistance, sensing that something unseen was pressing closer, rearranging my path, and preparing my heart for a revelation that would cost me everything, yet give me more than I had ever dared to hope. I did not know how to prepare, so I simply kept walking, praying, and breathing, unaware that the first crack had already appeared, and that soon the entire structure of my faith would collapse, a clearing the ground for a truth that would finally set me free. Those final quiet days before the storm were filled with restless nights, unanswered questions, and a longing so deep it ached, whispering that beyond fear and tradition waited a love strong enough to hold my broken soul and lead me. The fracture began the night my certainty finally broke. A 17-year-old student named Yusuf stood trembling in my office, his eyes hollow, his voice barely louder than breath. He whispered confessions so small they should have faded like dust, yet fear crushed his chest until he could hardly breathe. I listened, nodding, reciting warnings I had memorized since childhood, telling him to fast, to pray, to punish himself, because that was the only medicine I knew. 3 days later, they carried his body past the mosque doors, his feet wrapped in cloth, his face pale, and something inside me shattered. I washed his blood from my hands, but the guilt would not leave, and every verse I quoted echoed like an accusation. I began noticing cracks everywhere, in sermons that demanded money, in leaders who hid their sins, in councils where truth was traded for power. Each discovery scraped another layer from my faith until only raw questions remained. Late at night, I stared at the ceiling, wondering why mercy always came with conditions and love never stood alone. Fear warned me to stop, but grief pushed me forward, and trembling fingers typed forbidden words into a glowing screen. Who is Jesus? The pages that opened felt dangerous, yet strangely alive, filled with stories of healing, forgiveness, and a God who walked beside broken men. My heart pounded as I read, unterrified that angels might strike me down, yet unable to turn away. Every testimony sounded like the answer to a question I had buried for decades, and every scripture whispered of freedom I had never known. By dawn, my eyes burned, my throat ached, and my certainty lay in ruins. Still, I put on my robe, stepped into the mosque, and recited words that now tasted like ash. The men behind me trusted my voice, but my heart was screaming for honesty, and with every bow I felt heavier. I remembered Yusuf's face, the rope, the silence, and my chest tightened until I could hardly stand. After prayer I lingered alone, the lamps humming, the carpet still warm, and for the first time in my life I spoke without rehearsal. God, if you are real, if you hear the cries I have swallowed, if you exist beyond these walls, show me the truth, even if it destroys everything I am. The words hung in the silent hall, trembling like fragile glass, and I felt something unseen stir, as if heaven itself had leaned closer, listening. Fear surged, hope flickered, and I walked out into the pale morning light, knowing nothing would ever be the same, yet unaware how quickly my life would unravel, how brutally my questions would be answered, and how deeply the God I sought would soon invade my fragile world, tearing apart everything familiar to reveal a love I had never believed possible, a mercy stronger than fear, and a truth that would demand my whole heart, my reputation, my family, and my life. The waiting began that very moment, a tense stillness stretching across every hour, every prayer, every breath, as though unseen hands were rearranging my destiny piece by piece, and preparing me for a collision between fear and faith, between tradition and truth, between the life I had built and the life I was about to lose. I walked through crowded streets, feeling strangely detached, hearing familiar greetings, like echoes from another world, watching children play, merchants argue, and worshippers hurry to prayer, all unaware that a storm was forming inside my chest. Sleep deserted me, food lost its taste, and silence grew louder than any sermon. Each memory of Yusuf reopened the wound, and each verse I recited felt like a question rather than an answer. I sensed invisible eyes watching, unseen forces measuring my heart, waiting for the moment I would finally surrender control. Though I could not name it, a strange expectancy settled over me, heavy and electric, promising either destruction or deliverance. And I clung to routine as a drowning man clings to wreckage, unaware that the tide was already pulling me toward an encounter that would shatter my remaining defenses, silence my arguments, and expose the hunger I had hidden since childhood, a hunger not for certainty, but for love, not for power, but for peace, not for rules, but for a living God who would step into my darkness and call me by name. That night I lay awake, staring into shadows, whispering my question again, and somewhere beyond the veil of fear, I sensed an answer drawing near, slow and unstoppable, like dawn over desert sand, promising revelation, confrontation, and a rebirth I could not comprehend. The morning it happened began like every other, with cold water on my face, whispered intentions, and the familiar weight of duty settling on my shoulders. The mosque was quiet, that the air still heavy with night, and my footsteps echoed softly as I took my place at the front. As I lifted my hands and began the opening words of prayer, a strange pressure filled my chest, not pain, not fear, but a sudden, overwhelming awareness that something unseen was about to cross into my world. I bowed, then lowered myself into sujud, pressing my forehead into the carpet, and in that instant my heart seized. There was no warning, no gradual fading, only a violent silence as breath abandoned my lungs, and the world collapsed inward. Darkness swallowed me whole, thick and absolute, yet I remained conscious, suspended in a void that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Terror surged as I realized I could not move, could not speak, could not breathe, and the weight of every sin, every harsh word, every moment of pride descended upon me like a crushing mountain. The darkness pulsed, alive with judgment, and I felt myself sinking, as though invisible hands were dragging me downward into an abyss where hope did not exist. I tried to scream, to pray, to recite verses, but no sound emerged, and the familiar words evaporated before they could form. Just as despair reached its peak, a faint glow pierced the blackness, distant yet irresistible, drawing me toward it with a force gentler than breath. The light grew, unfolding into a radiance that banished fear, and within it stood a figure whose presence filled every corner of the void with peace. His eyes held both sorrow and joy, justice and mercy, and when he looked at me, I felt completely known, every secret exposed yet lovingly covered. I knew without being told that this was Jesus, and the name forbidden on my lips, the truth my heart had longed for in silence. He did not accuse me. He welcomed me, and in his gaze I saw the weight of my failures lifted, replaced by a compassion so deep it shattered my defenses. Scenes unfolded before me, revealing my life, my choices, the boy I had failed, the fear I had spread, and the chains I had worn, yet each image was met with forgiveness, not condemnation. Then I saw the cross, towering yet tender, stained with sacrifice, and I understood in a single overwhelming moment that love had paid the price I could never repay. tears streamed from my soul as gratitude and sorrow intertwined, and I collapsed at his feet undone. He lifted me gently, his touch steady and warm, and spoke words that vibrated through every fiber of my being, telling me I was chosen, forgiven, and loved beyond measure. In that light I felt life surge through me, not the fragile life of flesh, but a living hope that ignited my spirit and chased away the last remnants of fear. Time ceased to exist, and yet everything felt urgent, purposeful, alive. He showed me faces I had not yet met, hearts hungry for truth, and paths I had never imagined walking. Then his voice grew solemn yet kind, commanding me to return, to bear witness, to speak of what I had seen, and to proclaim that he alone was the way. As his words settled into my soul, the light began to fade, not into darkness, but into a gentle glow that guided me back toward the world I had left. The void receded, sensation returned, and a violent gasp tore through my chest as breath rushed into lungs that had been still for hours. Pain flared, sounds crashed in, and the sterile scent of death gave way to the sharp sting of antiseptic. My eyes flew open beneath harsh lights, and voices shouted in panic, but all I could hear was the echo of his promise, resounding within me like a living flame. I had crossed the boundary of death, and returned, carrying a truth too powerful to contain, a calling too urgent to ignore, and a love too deep to deny. And even as confusion swirled around my awakening, I knew beyond doubt that my life no longer belonged to me, but to the one who had met me in darkness and called me back into the light. I woke to cold metal beneath my back and the sharp, sterile scent of the morgue. My body felt heavy, yet alive in ways I had never known. Something inside me insisted on movement, on sound, and then my lips began to sing, unbidden, words I had never spoken aloud, melodies that belonged to another world. Yesu, Yesu, I love you, Yesu. The doctors froze, staring in disbelief, their faces pale and strained as the sound echoed across the room. My family stood at the door, horror etched into every line of their faces. My brother's eyes widened, voice trembling with anger and fear. "What have you done?" he hissed, clutching my shoulder. I tried to speak, but only the song came, pouring out of me like a river I could not dam. The words carried no fear, only a certainty so profound that even my own mind could not deny it. Every note burned into me, every syllable a confession of a truth that had been revealed in the space between life and death. I saw again the radiance, the eyes full of love, the presence that had held me while I was gone, and my heart trembled with awe and fear, and the hospital staff recoiled, whispering urgently, unsure if they should call security or summon a cleric, their faces pale and trembling. My wife collapsed into a chair, hands pressed to her mouth, silent tears running down her cheeks. Confusion filled the room, a suffocating fog of disbelief and terror. I tried to explain, to tell them what had happened, but words seemed hollow, incapable of conveying the weight of what I had seen and felt. All I could do was sing, and in singing I felt alive in a way I had never felt before. Every fear, every doubt, every hollow emptiness swept away by the flood of presence I could no longer deny. As news spread, whispers followed me down the hallways of the hospital. The Sheikh. He is alive. But fear gripped the community. Friends avoided my eyes. Students recoiled. And yet, inside me, certainty blazed brighter than any candle or sunbeam. Jesus was real. He had met me in death and called me back, and no shadow of human fear could erase that truth. My brother leaned closer, voice low and dangerous. "You have brought shame upon us," he said, and I felt a cold wave of grief at the distance that now separated us. I wanted to reach for him, to explain, but the words were swallowed by awe and by the relentless, consuming certainty that this was the beginning of a life I could not reclaim, that the world I had known, the respect, the authority, the recognition was gone, and in its place stood a calling far greater, far heavier, far more alive than I had ever imagined. I sang until my voice cracked, until exhaustion threatened to pull me back into the stillness I had once known, but I could not stop. My soul had tasted freedom, had seen the impossible, had known love that surpassed understanding. And even as fear, disbelief, and anger swirled around me, I felt a peace that no human judgment could touch. My old life had ended in the cold of the morgue, and a new life had begun in the song of resurrection, a life that belonged not to my family, my title, or my culture, but to Him who had met me where I was and lifted me into a truth that would never let me go. In that moment, I knew I would never again walk as the Sheikh everyone expected me to be. I would walk as a servant of the God who had embraced me in death and called me back into the light, and I would carry that song wherever the world tried to silence it. The days after I woke were a blur of fear, isolation, and disbelief. My family no longer spoke to me, my wife left with our children, and the neighbors who once bowed when I passed now avoided my eyes as if I were cursed. Former students spat when they saw me, and whispers followed me like a shadow, each word a reminder that I no longer belonged to the world I had built. Officials questioned me, demanded explanations, threatened my life, and every corner of my home felt like a trap. I wandered the streets in disguise, heart pounding, stomach empty, yet an unshakable truth pulsed in my chest. Jesus was alive, and He had called me to follow Him no matter the cost. Alone in a small, rented apartment, I downloaded a Bible app on a hidden phone and began to read John, the words piercing through years of fear and guilt. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I wept. I wept for Yusuf, for my family, for the students I had failed, and for myself, the boy who had been afraid to hope, the man who had feared love. Each verse lit a fire in me, showing me mercy I had never known, forgiveness I could not earn, and a calling I could not ignore. Fear rose again. What if I was discovered? What if they came for me tonight? But the peace that had flooded my soul in the morgue held me steady. I whispered prayers into the empty apartment, asking for guidance, for courage, for protection. The weight of solitude pressed on me, but I felt a hand unseen guiding me, reminding me that I was not truly alone. Then, late one evening, a knock at my door froze me. My heart raced. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I opened it slowly, finding a believer, a stranger, who smiled gently and whispered, "Come with me. You are safe here." That single gesture ignited hope. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a thread of connection, a promise that faith did not have to be secret, that community could exist even in exile. I stepped into the night with trembling legs, carrying my fear and my faith together, aware that every step forward might cost me everything, yet trusting that the life I had glimpsed beyond death was worth more than any earthly security. In that quiet, hidden moment, I understood that abandonment, shame, and loss were part of the path I had been called to walk, but they were also the soil in which a new life of trust, worship, and courage could grow. I did not know where this path would lead, but I felt the pulse of God's presence steady beneath my feet, and for the first time I allowed myself to hope that I could walk it to the end. I met the underground church in a small, dimly lit apartment, the air thick with incense and whispered prayers. The first time I stepped inside, my hands shook, my heart pounding as though it could escape my chest. These were men and women who had chosen faith at the cost of everything: families, reputations, freedom, and yet their eyes held a peace I had never seen in the halls of mosques or the classrooms where I had taught. I knelt with them, my forehead pressed against the cold floor, and for the first time in decades I felt a God who was present not through fear, not through rules, but through love. They sang in whispers, sometimes in English, sometimes in Arabic, and I learned the melodies slowly, letting the words settle deep inside me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Tears ran freely as I realized that the chains I had worn for 47 years, chains of expectation, tradition, fear, were breaking. Flashbacks came unbidden, my father's harsh reprimands, my own scolding of Yusuf, the hollow sermons that demanded obedience but never offered comfort. In contrast, the gentle hands of Christ pressed down on my shoulders, even though I could not see him. His presence filled every crack in my heart. Each night I met secretly with these believers online as well, the glow of my phone illuminating my face in a dark apartment, each verse read from Scripture feeling like water poured into a parched desert. And yet danger lurked at every corner. Neighbors suspicious, officials watching, whispers of betrayal that could end in chains or death. One evening I knelt alone in prayer, trembling, whispering the words that became my lifeline. Even if I die, I belong to you. The conviction burned in me stronger than any fear, and I realized that surrendering to Christ was no longer optional. It was my only choice if I wanted to live fully, freely, and honestly. In that hidden, trembling fellowship, I discovered the fire of truth, merciful, consuming, relentless, and I knew that whatever came next, I would not turn back. The walls around my heart had fallen. The darkness could no longer claim me, and every secret prayer, every whispered plea, every beat of my anxious heart was now alive with the certainty that the God I had feared could finally be trusted. I understood then that faith was not merely knowledge or ritual. It was surrender, risk, and intimacy, and I had been given a chance to embrace it fully, no matter the cost. And the confrontation came sooner than I expected. My former imam, the man who had taught me the Quran and molded my life, stood in my small apartment, face tight with anger and disbelief. Beside him was my eldest brother, eyes blazing, hands trembling, trying to hold back shame and fury. "Renounce this Jesus of yours," my brother hissed, voice low but dangerous. "Say it now, or you will destroy everything, your family, your honor, your life." I felt the old fear surge, that familiar icy grip around my chest, threatening to bend me back into obedience, into the life I had always known. But the memory of the light, the love, the peace that had held me when death had claimed me, rose like a fire inside. "I cannot," I said quietly at first, my voice almost lost beneath the tension in the room. "I have seen him. I have heard him. I cannot deny what I know is true." The imam stepped closer, leaning over me, eyes narrow and voice sharp. "You dare betray Allah? You bring shame upon your family, upon your lineage, upon the faith itself. I felt a wave of grief, grief for the people I loved who could not yet see, grief for the boy I had been who only knew fear, grief for the students I had led into walls of expectation. I am not betraying anyone, I whispered. I am following truth. I am following life. They shouted. Tears streaked down my brother's face. Rage boiled in the imams, and for a moment I feared I would be torn apart, by hands or by fear itself. Slaps fell, words cut sharper than knives, accusations of insanity and deceit, yet still I stood, heart trembling but soul unshakable. I spoke of mercy I had felt, of love that had held me when I was dead, of forgiveness that covered even my mistakes. The room pulsed with tension, grief, and anger, yet something in their eyes flickered, a hesitation, a question, a crack in the certainty they wielded like a sword. I did not wait for understanding. I could not. The truth inside me demanded witness. I would not deny him, not for wealth, not for reputation, not even for my family's acceptance. When the imam grabbed my arm, shaking me, I only held my ground tighter, whispering a prayer for strength and courage. The confrontation ended not in violence but in removal. They dragged me into the street, shouting at neighbors and officials alike, threatening consequences I could barely comprehend. I stumbled into the cool night, uncertain if I would survive another hour, and yet for the first time I felt alive in a way I never had when I was revered as a sheikh. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was a testament to the love that had called me back from death, a love stronger than fear, stronger than family, stronger than tradition. And even as darkness pressed in from every side, physical, emotional, cultural, I knew that I had chosen the only path that could carry me into truth and freedom, no matter what tomorrow held. Prison was cold, dark, and suffocating, yet within its walls I discovered a strange, unshakable peace. The clatter of chains and the distant shouts of other prisoners faded beneath a deeper presence that pressed against my chest and whispered, "You are not alone?" I knelt on the concrete floor, hands lifted, eyes closed, and for the first time truly worshipped without fear of judgment, without the weight of expectation pressing down on me. My voice trembled at first, then grew stronger, carrying scripture, songs, and whispered prayers into the stillness. Men I had never met paused to listen. Some drew closer, curiosity softening their hardened faces. I shared the story of Jesus with them, not in lectures, but in simple words that trembled with the same awe I still carried. Some nodded, others wept quietly, and a few secretly believed. Even in chains I tasted freedom, a freedom that no prison could contain. Nights passed, filled with whispers of hope, and days with a calm that confounded the guards. I slept little, praying much, each breath a reminder that life is not measured by walls or authority, but by the soul's connection to God. Weeks turned to months, and then word came that international attention had secured my release. I walked out into the daylight, eyes squinting, lungs filling with the scent of freedom, yet my heart mourned the family I had lost, the home I could never return to, the life I had once known. Still, the presence of Christ was with me, steady and warm, guiding every step into a world both foreign and unfamiliar. Each street corner, each passerby, each strange sky reminded me that I was no longer a sheikh among the faithful, but a servant of the one who had called me from death. My steps were cautious, yet my soul soared. I realized that exile was not punishment, but preparation, a space in which fear could no longer control me, and love could reign. As I crossed the threshold of that foreign land, I whispered a prayer, not for safety or wealth, but for courage, but for grace and for the strength to follow wherever he would lead. Every echo of the past, the threats, the whispers, the shame, faded beneath a new certainty. I was free in ways my old life could never have allowed. Chains could hold my body, but they could not hold my spirit. I carried the fire of truth, the songs of heaven, and the promise that even in loss, even in exile, God's love had claimed me, and I would never be the same again. The fear of yesterday no longer ruled my decisions. It had been replaced by a peace so complete it felt as though the angels themselves were walking beside me, urging me forward into the work, the ministry, and the testimony that would define the rest of my days. I was still broken, still grieving, but I was alive in him, fully, irreversibly, and nothing the world could offer or take away would change that. With every step on unfamiliar soil, I felt the pulse of eternity beneath my feet, a rhythm of life that no human judgment could silence, a calling too great to ignore, a love too profound to deny. Years have passed since I first returned from death, yet every morning I wake with the same awe and trembling I felt that first sunrise in freedom. I live now as a servant of Christ, traveling among those who are persecuted, sharing the testimony of a life once bound by fear, tradition, and obedience to rules that could never satisfy the soul. My children remain distant, separated by culture, distance, and the choices I made, and each night I pray for their salvation with a longing that pierces deeper than any loss I have known. Yet even in that longing, I am not empty, for I carry the presence of Jesus with me, steady and unchanging. And I remember the Sheikh I once was, revered and feared, standing tall before men who bowed to authority, yet inside I was hollow, haunted, and alone. That man is dead. In his place stands someone who has seen death, been cradled by mercy, and returned to proclaim life. I serve underground churches, mentor believers in secret, and bear witness to a God who meets the broken where they are, who calls the rejected into family, and who transforms fear into courage, shame into testimony, and death into eternal hope. I do not walk this path lightly. The world still watches, threats linger, and my heart still aches for the family I lost. But nothing can undo the certainty that Jesus is alive, that his love is relentless, and that his grace is sufficient for every wound, every failure, every secret sorrow. I speak now to those who feel trapped and afraid or invisible, those whose faith is questioned, whose families reject them, whose pasts are heavy with shame. There is a God who has walked into darkness to find you, who will meet you in your fear, and who will call you into a life fuller than you ever imagined. I am living proof that death does not have the final word, that the weight of sin can be lifted, and that love can reach places the world cannot touch. I died a sheikh, a man who carried fear and expectation like chains. But I rose a son of God, free, chosen, redeemed, and called to walk boldly in truth. My story is not mine alone. It belongs to everyone who longs for freedom, who hungers for mercy, who dares to follow a God who loves beyond measure. I stand today, heart open, soul alive, voice unafraid, and I testify, Jesus is real. He is alive. He transforms, restores, and redeems. And even when the world rejects you, even when family turns away, even when death itself seems final, his love will find you, will hold you, and will call you to rise. I have risen, and in him so can you.